Well, I just want to say a greeting to you, people that are watching this online in whatever form that might be. Um, this is something that in my 40, I discovered that I actually have 40 years in right now. When I retire in June, it'll technically be 40.5 years. I didn't know that until this week. But in my 40.5 years, I've never had an occasion like this where it's been decided that we are not going to gather for worship. And in the time of this pandemic, it seemed like a good idea for me to talk to you all today. And then just to tell you that this weekend, the next part 4, I think it would be, in our Time to Dream teaching series will continue Saturday night at 6:11 and then Sunday at 10. So if you want to tune in on either of the three choices, I believe, that you have between Facebook, YouTube, or the church website, we'll welcome you to come back then. It was interesting to me talking about last Saturday night when we did have worship in the Pine City location. 3 different people noticed that it was live online. 3 people told me this, that they noticed there were over 350 people watching Saturday night. That just amazed me to realize the magnitude of this technology can be far. We maybe had 50 or 60 here in person, but 350 plus watching is pretty amazing. Now, I don't know how many of them were sleeping during the message, but just saying. So today, we're going to talk, my title is Walking Without Fear Through the Valley of Virus. And I'm basing that kind of on David saying in the 23rd Psalm, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And I think of David, and he in his life had many encounters with death, where he thought he was a goner, and God delivered him. And we read about that in the Old Testament. So maybe today David would say, even though I walk through the valley of virus, I don't know if he'd say that or not. But we just want to reassure you that even when we face times of fear and uncertainty and even death, that God is with us. I think of a couple of near-death experiences that at least I felt that way at the time, having to do with, we're going to be talking today about Jesus on the lake called Galilee, or the Sea of Galilee. My experiences, the first couple that I would share with you took place on Seneca Lake, my lake, if you will. And one of them was when I was probably 21 or 22 years old. A couple of my college buddies were driving my dad's boat, and I had them pulling me on water skis. I was probably showing off a little bit that I could ski and they couldn't, So I'm back there behind the boat, and they're talking to each other. They didn't know what I was doing. They weren't watching me. But I'm looking ahead of the boat, and we're headed toward Geneva, as I recall. And suddenly I see this lightning bolt hit on the lake right in front of the boat. You think that got my attention? And so what do? And those boys didn't even know about the lightning bolt. They were just probably talking about girls or something like that back then. So I let go of the rope, and they finally noticed I wasn't back there. They came back to get me. What's going on? Did you see that lightning? No, I didn't see any lightning bolt. And we hightailed it in for shore and lived to tell about it. There was another time, Linda and I were Lodi State Park, which is across the lake and probably 10 miles north of us. And we're over there, and we're coming back in the boat, and the storm came up. And it was lightning, and we didn't dare stay out on the water. We put the boat in on the side of the opposite side of the lake from where we were and waited for the storm to go by. There's other times when we've been out on the lake and you can see a storm and you outrun the storm. When you have a boat that goes 30 miles an hour-ish or better, you can get out of the way of the storm sometimes. But the story that we're going to look at today, they didn't have a motor and they didn't have any way to get out of the way of the storm. But I would turn to Mark's Gospel, chapter 4. And chapter 4 begins with this verse. Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in the boat out on the lake, while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. Now, apparently, The water acted as a Jesus sound system. He didn't have powered speakers and an amp or anything like that, but the water helped his voice carry. And he's talking to likely thousands of people, and evidently it worked because the people could hear him. And he taught for what might have been the whole day. And then it says, Mark 4, verse 35, that day when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drowned?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" So it's interesting to me that every day with Jesus seems like it was an adventure. When he says that you have no faith, you still have no faith, I'm reminded of Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. We call this the faith chapter of the Bible. And the author of Hebrews says this, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we don't see." So they did not have confidence at that time or assurance, but faith is confident assurance. Three things about faith that we can learn from this story, that even the people closest to Jesus struggled with faith. Is that reassuring to know that even these guys that have spent many years with him, he says, "Do you still have no faith?" They lacked confident assurance. Instead, terror took over them. They were just terrified by what was happening. Now, these were seasoned lake people. These are many of them were fishermen, and it says Jesus wants to go across the lake. It says they took him along just as he was, very passive. Come on, Jesus, we'll throw him in the boat, and Jesus had no role to play in getting the boat across the lake. In fact, he takes a nap. He needed the nap. He's taught and ministered to people and probably healed and done miracles, and he was exhausted. And so he's just so much comfortable in his own skin that he goes to sleep in the back of the boat. But the people closest to him see that squall come up. Now for us, we might relate better to the snow squalls that we see in New York State in the winter sometimes. Have you ever driven between Syracuse and Watertown and watched the lake effect come across you there? Or west of Bath, going up toward Geneseo, Dansville area? You get snow squalls there sometimes where you can't see a thing, and it's pretty scary. You want to slow right down. Well, this is their version of a snow squall, and they're just terrified, and they wake him up. "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" I imagine by now they've tried everything they can do to fix the problem themselves. If they have something to bail with, they're throwing water out of the boat. They're using their hands to throw the water out of the boat. They're soaking wet, drenched to the skin. How did Jesus sleep through that, I wonder? That cushion must have been sopping wet. But they wake him up. He is just so comfortable in his own skin that he's just sleeping away. "Jesus, don't you care that we're about to drown?" So I take from that it's okay for you and me to have our struggles from time to time. It's okay when we face this pandemic to get scared at first, and I think after a little time of thinking about it and talking about it and praying about it, we'll come through it better. But I did a little thinking and research into those words for pandemic and epidemic. Epidemic, E-P-I, means near or upon, close. So an epidemic would be when a disease is actively spreading in a near region, in a certain defined area. Epi means pertaining to some, where pan is all. A pandemic is the disease that's pertaining to the whole country or the whole world. It's much more serious. It's all inclusive, if you will. I have found myself watching the trailer on the bottom of the news reports, and how many have you seen about that on TV these days? You can't miss it. I see that word pandemic, and sometimes I've wanted to say pandemonium. And that caused me to see if there was any connection there. I looked up the definition of pandemonium, and it's utter chaos, wild confusion, anarchy, bedlam. Does that sound like some reactions to this pandemic right now? And I learned furthermore that the author, John Milton, in 1665 wrote the book Paradise Lost. And Milton was good at creating his own words. He invented the word pandemonium. And you know, pan means all. You know what demonia means? All devils, all demons. And he's saying that pandemonium is the abode of demons. And so when we talk about anarchy and utter chaos and confusion, that's demonic. And we have to be careful not to give in to the abode of demons when we get into this, but to realize that God is in control, that as those disciples wanted to swerve toward pandemonium, they needed Jesus to say, quiet, be still to that storm. So while we have these seasoned fishermen bailing furiously, trying to fix their own problem, we see that their faith requires humility, and humility seeks help. So rather than struggling to fix it ourselves, faith reminds us that we need to be humble before God. As I said last week, be humble lest you stumble. It's when you humbly depend on God, and humility says it's okay to ask for help. It was okay for them to wake up Jesus and say, Lord, are you going to help us here? When in the midst of being terrified and trying to control things and fix them ourselves, faith leads us to humility, and humility causes us to seek help from God. Now, I'd wondered before, why didn't they just swim for shore? You know, Jesus, bye, we're going to swim in. Well, the Sea of Galilee really reminded me a lot when I was there one time of the Finger Lakes, you know, and I was telling some folks that we arrived in Tiberias in Galilee on the lake like at 10 or 11 at night. It was dark. But riding the bus, you could see over to the left, and it reminds me if I were driving from Geneva toward Watkins on Route 14 along the lake, you can tell there's got to be a lake there because there's no lights. You see lights on the far side of the lake and lights on this side. And it was that way as we came by the Sea of Galilee into this little, not such a little city of Tiberias. And we stayed there, and I got up. This will surprise you. I was jet lagged too, but I got up at like 3 in the morning their time, and I did something very stupid. I got away with it. I went out wandering around Tiberias trying to find the lake, you know, and I kept sniffing around, and I found the lake, and they told me later, do you realize what danger you were in out there by yourself? Nobody would have known where you were. Well, I didn't think of that at the time. But the Sea of Galilee is 8 miles east to west and 13 miles north to south. So it's not like swimming across Seneca Lake even, but it's much further, and it's in the middle of a storm, so I don't think that even occurred to the disciples to swim. I love where Jesus has that composure or that confident assurance that they just took him along just as he was in the boat, you know, and Jesus was very comfortable and not uptight and worried. He could say, quiet, be still, and the storm and the waves listened to him. And then what's the reaction of the disciples in Matthew 8:27? It says, the men were amazed, and they asked, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. So part of their experience was to discover more about Jesus, that he could bring composure and calm to the midst of the pandemonium. And he was there on their journey to discovery. The word journey, I've gotten more into word backgrounds, and that the word journey, Jour, is the word for day. And so your journey is a day's trip at a time. Every day with Jesus had to have been an adventure, a discovery of more about who he was and how to understand what Jesus meant to them. There is a song that goes back in my memory quite a few years, but the words are, "If I never had a problem, I'd never know that God could solve it." So it's when we have our problems and our crises and the times that we're terrified that we learn more about how God can solve those problems. And as we face this uncertain time right now, we can rest assured that God's got this. Amen? So I would ask you, in your case, what's limiting your faith? Is it your pride, your lack of humility, being unwilling to ask God for help? Does that limit your faith? The problem is that we think our circumstances are stronger than our God. We think our circumstances are stronger than our God, and that terrifies us. There's an expression sometimes you ask, well, how you doing? And they'll say, well, pretty good under the circumstances. I'd like to ask, what are you doing under there? Why be under those circumstances? Why allow the circumstances of your life take away your faith? God is stronger than my circumstances. God is stronger than your circumstances. Here and now, this pandemic was unexpected. Even a couple of weeks ago, we didn't see the implications of all of this. But this is going to come and go eventually. But guess what? There will be other pandemics. There'll be other challenges that we face. Will we learn faith and humility and to seek God for help the next time? What do we learn as we apply our lessons learned here and now to the next experience that we face? How can we change? We can change when we choose trust over fear. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Choose trust over fear. Pastor Judah Smith said this: "Our anxiety does not come from thinking about the future, but rather from wanting to control the future. Anxiety doesn't remove tomorrow's suffering. It only removes today's strength. Rest in who Jesus is and give all fears and anxieties to him." Amen? So don't allow anxiety to consume you, to sap your strength. I love it where Peter says, now Peter, who was very likely in that boat that day, probably one of the know-it-all fishermen that said, yeah, Jesus, you're the carpenter. You just lay down back there. I got this. Peter writes this years later, and he says this in 1 Peter chapter 5. I'm going to read 6 through 10. "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that God may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist the devil, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast." So we need to resist the devil and realize it's the devil that would sabotage and have us give up and throw up our hands and drown in our anxiety. But we're assured that as we cast our cares and anxiety on the Lord, he will care for us. So back to the lesson of Hebrews 11:1. Trust equals confidence. Trust equals assured confidence. Confidence in what we hope for. Assurance about what we can't even see. One of my favorite little sayings that I've said many times over 40 and a half years is this: you cannot worry and trust God at the same time. Say that with me. you cannot worry and trust God at the same time. Philippians 4, 6 and 7, write that down. Philippians 4, 6 and 7. Paul understands this when he says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in the knowledge and love of God. So, as we apply this understanding to where we are right now, should we practice social distancing? No. Physical distancing, yes. You know, that 6 foot thing's okay. But social distancing, let's be sure we don't do that. Let's not all retreat into our own little cocoons and be distant from other people, but let's be creative in ways that with a phone call or a text or a IM or some way we can reach out for people that are going through this pandemonium and that we can encourage them. We are supposed to be the church, whether we're gathered in the building or whether we're distributed in the world. We are called to be the church of Jesus Christ, distributed. I think of Jesus saying, you are the salt of the earth. The salt does no good when it's in the salt shaker. We're supposed to be salty Christians in the world that needs a flavor of Jesus. We're called to be Jesus with skin on. I was impressed by one of our church leaders who wrote an email. Now, I'm going to just quote a little bit of this. She says, we need to be a church of action even in a time of physical distancing. We cannot be socially distant. Pastor Bill said that, and I think it's brilliant. That's why I'm reading it, because she thinks I'm brilliant. What about our congregation and community? What holes does not having growth groups cause? Are there people that are isolated? And then she goes on to say, I'm thinking about, and she names the person who posted on Facebook, I just need a loaf of bread. Or, this woman is immune deprived. She can't go out into the world. Just one example. Or somebody else that had shoulder surgery recently and she can't drive, and they've discontinued her physical therapy because of everything going on right now. What about this woman? Does she need some encouragement? How's she getting her groceries? How can we help people like that if they're lonely? What elderly person might need help or might not even understand the lack of availability of things at the grocery store? Who needs toilet paper? How much have you hoarded? Share it with them. What about the staff of the restaurants and the gyms that have been closed? What about the people who are getting laid off because their businesses are being closed? What can we dream about in this time to dream? What can we dream about, and how can we be Jesus with skin on? How can we be the church distributed in our world? How can we get out of the salt shaker? Are there moms or dads who need help with homeschooling right now? Can we help provide Bible curriculum to those that are suddenly educating their children at home? Could we help with somebody's babysitting needs or issues? Who do you know? Who do you know that you could reach out to? Maybe not physically close to them, but socially you could care for them and show that they matter to you. We are to be Christ followers, and we are to be in the world and sharing the love of God with our world. As we close in prayer, I'm inspired to sing the words of a song that was planned to be used this week. It was one of the songs that if we had worship together, the band was going to sing at all of the campuses. And it's the song, Fail Us Not. And this song is really a prayer. It's directed to God. I'd like to share some of these words. I thought I might sing it to you, but no, you'd tune right out if I did that. Let us be in a spirit of prayer. God, failure doesn't faze you. Worry doesn't win. Loss doesn't leave you afraid to start again. Our sin doesn't shock you. Our shame doesn't shame you at all. Mistakes do not move you. Terror doesn't tame. Death doesn't doom you to life in the grave. Our suffering doesn't scare you. Our secrets won't surprise you at all. There is nothing above you. There is nothing beyond you. There is nothing that you can't do. There is no one beside you. There is no one that's like you. There is nothing that you can't do. Whatever will come, will rise above. You fail us not. You fail us not. No matter the war, our hope is secure. You fail us not. You fail us not. Hatred doesn't hide you. Evil doesn't ail. Despair can't despise you and tell you that you failed. Our doubt doesn't daunt you. Our darkness won't defeat you at all. You're bigger than the battle. You're bigger than the battle has ever been. Whatever will come, will rise above. You fail us not. You fail us not. No matter the war, our hope is secure. You fail us not. You fail us not. Amen.